If I had known that 1 second of distraction would change my entire life, I would have never turned that wheel. The rain was coming down hard that night, the kind that blurred streetlights into long streaks of gold and red across the windshield. And I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old sedan as I drove through the outskirts of downtown Chicago, about 12 miles from home, telling myself to just make it through the next few minutes. My name is Emily Carter, and at 24 years old, I had learned to live with exhaustion as if it was normal, working double shifts at a small downtown clinic and studying at night, always chasing a future that never seemed close enough. That night, I was late again, my phone buzzing with missed messages I didn't have the energy to read, my mind already split between responsibility and survival, when headlights in my rearview mirror made me realize I wasn't alone on the road. A black SUV had appeared behind me, massive and silent, following at a distance that felt too intentional to ignore, and something in my chest tightened as I tried to change lanes, only to feel my tires slip slightly on the wet pavement. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, just reacting, and in that split second of hesitation, my car veered too close at an intersection where everything happened at once. The impact wasn't dramatic like in movies, but it was enough to freeze the world for a heartbeat, my car coming to an abrupt stop against the side of that black SUV, rain hissing against both vehicles as silence swallowed the street. I remember my hands shaking as I pressed them against the steering wheel, my breath uneven, trying to understand what I had just done when the driver's door of the SUV opened. The man who stepped out didn't react the way I expected anyone to react in that situation. He wasn't shouting, wasn't rushing, wasn't even visibly angry. He just stood there in the rain like he had all the time in the world, as if the collision had been nothing more than an interruption in something far larger than me. He was tall, dressed in a dark tailored coat that didn't seem affected by the weather, and when he finally looked at me through the rain, it felt like the air itself had shifted. I should have apologized immediately, should have explained, should have done something normal, but I couldn't move. There was something about him that didn't belong to the world I knew, something controlled, distant, and impossibly confident. He walked closer, stopping just a few feet from my window, rain sliding off his shoulders, and I remember rolling the window down just enough to speak, my voice barely steady as I tried to explain it was an accident. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied me in a way that made me feel like I was being measured for something I didn't understand. And then he spoke, his voice calm, low, almost certain. "Step out of the car, Emily Carter." I froze because I never told him my name. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. The rain was still falling hard enough to blur the world beyond my windshield. But inside the car, everything felt strangely still, like the universe had paused to watch what I would do next. My fingers were locked around the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and I remember my throat going dry as I tried to process the fact that this stranger, standing outside in the storm like it did not matter at all, had just said my full name without hesitation. I should have been afraid of the accident itself, of the damage, of the consequences that would normally follow something like this, but instead my attention kept drifting back to him. He was not looking at the damaged vehicles the way anyone else would. There was no anger in his expression, no confusion, no urgency. It was as if the entire situation had already been accounted for long before I arrived. I lowered the window slightly more, just enough for the cold air to rush in, and I repeated myself, telling him again that it was an accident, that I was sorry, that I would pay for the damages if I needed to, my voice breaking slightly under the pressure of everything happening too fast. He did not move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening to something behind my words rather than the words themselves. Then he finally spoke again, his tone still calm, still controlled, but now carrying something I could not identify at first. "You are not leaving this scene," he said, and I remember a strange discomfort settling in my chest, because it did not sound like a threat, and it did not sound like a request either. It sounded like a fact. Before I could respond, one of the doors of the SUV behind him opened again, and two more men stepped out, both dressed in dark clothing that blended into the night. They did not rush toward me, did not shout, did not even acknowledge me directly. Instead, they positioned themselves quietly at a distance that made it clear I was not alone anymore, and my breathing became uneven as I realized the space around me had changed in a way I did not understand. I looked back at the man in front of me, searching for some kind of explanation, but his expression remained unchanged, as if this was all normal. My instinct told me to start the car and leave, but something about the way those men had moved made that thought feel impossible. Instead, I forced myself to speak again, asking him who he was, my voice smaller than I intended. For the first time, he seemed to consider my question, as if deciding whether I needed an answer at all. The rain slid down his face as he took one step closer to my window, and when he spoke again, his voice lowered just enough that I had to focus completely to hear him. "My name is Adrian Cole," he said, and there was a pause after that, a brief silence that felt heavier than the storm around us. "And you just damaged something that belongs to me." My stomach tightened instantly, not because of anger, but because of the way he said it so simply, without emotion, as if ownership was not a concept to debate, but a condition already established. I tried to respond, to explain again, to insist that it was a mistake, but the words did not come out the way I intended. Instead, I felt a sudden awareness that the situation had shifted completely away from anything I understood. Adrian Cole did not raise his voice, did not step back, did not react to my confusion. He simply looked at me as if he had already decided what would happen next, and then he said something that made the air inside my car feel even smaller. "Get out of the car, Emily. We are going to talk." The rain had not slowed when I finally stepped out of the car, and the moment my feet touched the wet pavement, I immediately regretted how exposed I felt standing there in the middle of an empty intersection with two damaged vehicles and a man who spoke like consequences were optional. The cold air hit my skin instantly, soaking through my thin jacket within seconds, and I remember wrapping my arms around myself instinctively as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Adrian Cole did not move closer at first. He simply watched me step out as if confirming a decision that had already been made long before I complied. The two men behind him remained in place, silent and still, positioned in a way that felt less like confrontation and more like containment. I did not like that thought, and I tried to push it away, telling myself again that this was just an accident, that I was overreacting, that I was simply dealing with an overly confident and intimidating stranger. But the way he looked at me made it difficult to hold on to that explanation. He gestured once toward the SUV behind him, and without raising his voice, he said I should come with him so we could handle the situation properly. There was no aggression in his tone, only certainty, and that certainty made something uneasy settle deep in my chest. I asked where we were going, forcing my voice to stay steady, and he answered without hesitation that we were going somewhere private, somewhere away from the street, where this would not turn into a problem for either of us. The way he said it made it sound like problems were something he controlled rather than something he avoided. I took a small step back instinctively, glancing toward my own car as if it could offer me some kind of escape, but one of the men shifted slightly, not blocking me, just enough to make me aware of how limited my choices actually were. Adrian noticed my hesitation immediately. He did not raise his voice or change his expression, but he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that felt uncomfortably precise. Then he said something unexpected. He told me I was not in trouble, which should have reassured me, but instead it only made things more confusing. I asked him why he knew my name, why he had been following me, and for the first time there was a brief pause before he answered. He said he was not following me, but that I had simply ended up in a situation connected to him, and that was enough for him to take interest. The explanation did not make sense to me, and I told him that directly, my frustration breaking through the fear. He did not argue. Instead, he walked past me toward the front of my car, examining the damage with a calm attention that felt almost detached, as if the accident itself was secondary to something else entirely. When he returned, he opened the passenger side door of the SUV and told me to sit inside so we could talk somewhere out of the rain. I hesitated again, my instincts screaming that I should leave, but the storm around us was growing heavier, and the empty road felt less like freedom and more like isolation. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The interior of the SUV was warm, quiet, and far more refined than anything I was used to, and as I sat down, I became painfully aware of how out of place I felt. Adrian entered from the other side and closed the door behind him, and in that enclosed space, his presence felt even more controlled, even more deliberate. He did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked forward through the windshield for a long moment as the driver adjusted course without needing instruction. Only then did he finally turn slightly toward me and say that what had happened outside was not random, and that I had just stepped into something I did not yet understand. The moment the door closed behind me, the world outside the SUV disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet space that felt too controlled to be accidental. The sound of rain became distant, muted by thick glass and leather interiors that smelled faintly of something expensive and unfamiliar. I sat very still, my hands resting on my knees because I did not know what else to do with them, and I remember thinking that I had made a mistake by getting inside, even though nothing explicitly dangerous had happened yet. Adrian Cole sat across from me, not rushed, not tense, just composed in a way that made the entire situation feel uneven. He did not immediately continue the conversation. Instead, he observed me again, as if confirming something he already believed. Outside, the city lights passed in blurred reflections across the window, but inside there was only silence and the soft hum of the engine. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower now, more deliberate, telling me that what I had done outside was not just a simple accident involving two vehicles. I frowned, asking him what he meant, and for the first time I saw something subtle shift in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to caution. He told me that the SUV I had hit was part of a protected convoy route, and that certain movements in this city were tracked, coordinated, and monitored in ways most people never noticed. I stared at him, trying to decide if I was hearing something real or something designed to intimidate me into compliance. I told him I did not understand how that had anything to do with me, that I was just driving home from work, exhausted, trying to get through a normal night like anyone else. He did not interrupt me. He let me speak completely, and that silence felt more unsettling than any argument would have been. When I finished, he leaned slightly forward, resting one arm on the seat beside him, and said something that made my stomach tighten. He said my route tonight was not random either, that I had crossed paths with something that was already in motion before I ever turned my steering wheel. I asked him if he was saying I was being watched, and he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window for a brief moment, as if choosing his next words carefully, then told me that watching was not the right word, but that certain patterns in the city were always being observed. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and unease rising in my chest, and I told him again that I was just a nurse, that I worked long shifts, that I had no connection to anything he was implying. That was when he finally looked directly at me again, and his tone softened slightly, though it did not lose its certainty. He said he already knew who I was, where I worked, and how I spent most of my days, and that none of that was the issue. The issue, he said, was that I had been present at the wrong place at a very specific moment, and that people who controlled certain things in this city did not believe in coincidence. I felt my heart rate increase, not because I understood everything he was saying, but because I understood enough to realize he was completely serious. The SUV slowed as we entered a quieter part of the city, away from the main streets, where buildings were spaced further apart and the lights felt colder. I asked him again where we were going, and this time he answered simply that we were going somewhere safe for now, because staying on the street after what happened would create a tension neither of us needed. I looked at him for a long moment, searching for any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but all I found was calm certainty. And in that moment, I realized the accident outside had not ended anything at all. It had only begun something I was not prepared to name. The further we moved away from the intersection, the more the city began to feel unfamiliar, as if I had crossed some invisible boundary without realizing it. The streets were quieter here, lined with taller buildings that blocked out most of the remaining light, and the reflections from passing street lamps slid across the interior of the SUV in slow, deliberate patterns. I kept my eyes forward, but my thoughts were anything but still. Adrian Cole had not spoken for several minutes, and that silence was starting to feel intentional rather than casual. I finally broke it by asking him again what exactly he meant when he said I had stepped into something I did not understand. He did not look at me immediately. Instead, he kept his gaze on the road ahead, as if measuring distance between answers rather than choosing words. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was a subtle weight behind it that made me listen more carefully than before. He said that certain actions in this city created ripple effects, and that most people live their entire lives without ever noticing them. But once someone crossed into those patterns, even accidentally, it became difficult to step out unnoticed. I frowned, asking him if he was talking about something illegal, something dangerous, or if he was simply trying to scare me into compliance after the accident. He did not react to the question directly. Instead, he told me that fear was usually a misunderstanding of scale, and that what I was feeling was not fear of him, but fear of context I had not yet seen. That answer did not help me at all, and I told him that clearly. He finally turned slightly toward me then, studying my face for a moment before speaking again. He said my life before tonight was structured around predictable systems: work, home, routine, responsibility, but that I had just collided with a layer of reality that operated differently. I asked him why he was involved in any of this if it was as complicated as he implied, and for the first time his expression shifted slightly, not into discomfort, but into something more controlled, as if he had heard that question many times before. He said he was involved because ignoring certain things was not an option for people in his position, and that my presence tonight had created a tension that would not simply disappear. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, and I asked him directly what he expected from me. He paused again, longer this time, and then said something that made my breathing slow without my permission. He said he expected me to stay close for a short time, until it was clear that whatever had been triggered by the accident was resolved. I immediately told him I could not do that I had a job, responsibilities, a life that did not include being taken into situations I did not understand. He listened without interrupting, then calmly said that he was not asking for permission in the way I was used to, but that I would not be forced either. The distinction confused me more than it reassured me. As the SUV continued forward, I noticed another vehicle ahead, subtle, matching our speed without overtaking, and when I glanced back at Adrian, he noticed immediately without needing to follow my gaze. He said that was exactly what he meant, that certain outcomes were already in motion, and that staying visible was now the least safe option for me. I felt my pulse tighten again as I realized he was not describing possibilities but treating them as certainties. I asked him if I was in danger, and this time he did not avoid the question. He looked at me directly and said that danger was not always immediate or visible, but that I had become relevant to people who did not appreciate unpredictability. The SUV finally slowed as we turned into a private driveway bordered by tall gates, and I realized I had no clear idea where I was anymore, only that my ordinary night had fully ended somewhere behind me, even if I still did not understand what had replaced it. The gates opened slowly as the SUV approached, revealing a long private driveway lined with dim lights that stretched deeper than I expected. The air inside the vehicle felt heavier the closer we moved inside, not because anything visible had changed, but because everything around it suggested control rather than openness. I found myself sitting straighter without realizing it, my hands resting tightly together in my lap as I tried to process how quickly my life had shifted from a simple drive home to whatever this was becoming. Adrian Cole did not speak immediately after we passed through the gates. The vehicle continued forward at a steady pace, tires rolling over smooth pavement that felt too quiet compared to the storm still raging somewhere behind us. Eventually, I broke the silence again, asking him where exactly we were, and he answered without turning toward me, saying it was one of his properties used when privacy was necessary. The way he said it made it sound like privacy was not a luxury, but an operational requirement. I asked him what kind of situation required this level of isolation, and for the first time, he gave a small exhale, almost like he was deciding how much truth I could handle. He said that certain accidents did not remain isolated events, especially when they occurred at intersections tied to controlled movement patterns. I told him again that I was just a nurse, that I did not understand any of what he was saying, and that I did not belong in any situation that required controlled movement patterns or private properties. He finally looked at me then, fully this time, and his expression softened just slightly, not into warmth, but into something closer to measured restraint. He said he already knew what I was, and that was exactly why I was not involved by choice. That statement made my stomach tighten, and I asked him what he meant by that. Before he could answer, the SUV came to a stop in front of a large building that I had not noticed approaching, partially hidden by trees and low lighting. The structure was modern, minimal, and silent, with no visible signs or markings that would indicate what it was used for. One of the doors opened from the outside before Adrian even reached for it, and I realized that someone had been waiting for us. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, nodding once toward Adrian without speaking, then briefly glancing at me, as if assessing a variable in a situation he already understood. Adrian exited the vehicle first and motioned for me to follow without urgency. I hesitated for only a second before stepping out, the cool air immediately replacing the controlled interior of the SUV. As I stood there, I noticed there were no other cars visible, no public access points, only controlled lighting and quiet movement from individuals who seemed to appear only when necessary. Adrian walked a few steps ahead of me, then stopped and finally turned fully toward me. For the first time since the accident, his tone shifted slightly, becoming more direct. He said that inside this building I would be safe for now, but safety did not mean freedom, and I needed to understand that distinction immediately. I asked him why I could not simply leave and return to my life, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said that leaving was not currently a matter of choice because my presence had already been registered in places where my name should not appear. I felt a cold pressure in my chest as I realized he was not trying to scare me. He was explaining something he considered factual. He stepped aside slightly, indicating the entrance, and said I could either remain outside in uncertainty or come inside and hear everything properly. The rain was still visible beyond the gates, distant now, as if belonging to a different world, and I realized I had already crossed too many boundaries to pretend I was still part of the life I had known hours earlier. For a moment after he spoke, I did not move. The entrance stood only a few steps away, softly lit and framed by clean architecture that felt more like a statement than a building. Everything about it suggested control, precision, and intention, none of which made me feel any calmer. Adrian stood beside me, not pushing, not pulling, simply waiting as if my decision was already part of something he had accounted for long before I arrived. I looked back toward the SUV once, as if it could offer me a reminder of the life I had just been pulled out of, but all I saw was distance, rain fading behind glass, and a driver already repositioning the vehicle without hesitation. My instincts told me to leave, to walk away, to find the nearest street and call someone I trusted, but the problem was I could not name a single outcome that made that feel safer than staying. I finally stepped forward, and the moment I did, the doors opened automatically, as if my decision had already been communicated ahead of time. The interior was warm, quiet, and impossibly clean, with lighting that softened every edge of the space without removing the feeling that I was being observed. Adrian entered behind me, and the doors closed without sound. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I stood near the entrance, unsure whether I was supposed to sit, move, or wait, until he gestured slightly toward a seating area and said I should take a moment. I obeyed because I could not think of a reason not to, and because every other option felt uncertain in a way I did not yet understand. When I finally sat down, I realized how tired I was, not just physically from the shift I had worked earlier that day, but emotionally from everything that had happened in a span of hours that should have been routine. Adrian remained standing for a moment, speaking briefly into a device I had not noticed before, his tone calm and controlled, giving instructions that I could not fully hear but instinctively felt were not about me personally, yet still involved me indirectly. When he finished, he turned back toward me and finally sat across from me, maintaining a distance that felt intentional rather than casual. I asked him again what was happening, my voice quieter now, not because I trusted him, but because I no longer had the energy to raise it. He studied me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his tone shifted slightly, becoming more structured, as if he was explaining something he had explained many times before. He said that what I had experienced earlier was a disruption in a controlled route, and that certain disruptions triggered responses that most people never witnessed. I asked him if he was talking about criminal activity, and he did not deny it, but he also did not confirm it in the way I expected. Instead, he said labels were irrelevant compared to structure, and structure was what kept everything functioning in ways most people never saw. I told him that I was not part of any structure, that I did not want to be part of anything like this, and that I needed to return to my life. That was when he leaned slightly forward, his expression sharpening just enough to make me stop speaking. He said my life had already intersected with his world at a point that could not be reversed simply by walking away. I felt my chest tighten again, and I asked him what he expected from me now. He paused for a moment, then said that for the next short period of time, I would remain under observation and protection until it was confirmed that the incident from the intersection would not escalate further. I told him I did not understand why that involved me specifically, and he answered without hesitation that I was present at the exact moment a protected asset was damaged, and that witnesses in those situations were not typically ignored by either side involved. The words made my stomach drop, not because they were threatening, but because of how casually he said them, as if they were standard procedure. I looked down for a moment, trying to steady myself, then asked him what would happen after that period ended. He did not answer immediately, and in that silence I understood that the answer was not something he was ready to define. Instead, he simply said that what happened next would depend on choices that had not been made yet, and for the first time since the accident, I realized that my life was no longer moving on its own timeline. The silence after his last words did not feel empty. It felt structured, like even quiet had rules in this place. I sat there trying to understand how a single night could erase the version of my life I had woken up with, and replace it with something that sounded more like a system than an accident. Adrian remained seated across from me, not rushing to fill the space, and that patience somehow made everything more difficult to process. I finally asked him what exactly he meant by observation, because the word itself carried too much weight to ignore. He looked at me for a moment before answering, his tone steady, explaining that observation meant ensuring that nothing connected to the intersection incident escalated beyond control, and that people involved indirectly were accounted for until resolution. I told him I was not a part of anything that required accounting, that I was a nurse, that my life was not supposed to involve being monitored or managed, and my voice sounded more fragile than I intended. He did not interrupt. Instead, he listened completely, then said something that unsettled me more than anything so far. He said intention did not determine impact, and that I had already become part of the outcome simply by being present at the wrong moment. I looked away for a second, trying to steady my breathing, feeling a strange pressure building behind my ribs that was not quite fear and not quite disbelief anymore. After a moment, I asked him what I was supposed to do now, and for the first time since I had met him, his answer was not immediate. He stood, walked a few steps toward a side console, and spoke briefly into a secure line, his tone lower than before, then returned and sat again. When he finally spoke to me, he said I would stay here temporarily, not as a prisoner, but as a precaution. The way he said it made the word precaution feel heavier than any restriction. I told him I did not agree to that, and he responded calmly that agreement was not always required for temporary containment when external factors were still unknown. I felt frustration rise in me, mixed with exhaustion, and I asked him why I could not simply go home and pretend none of this had happened. For the first time, something almost resembling softness entered his expression, not emotional softness, but restraint, as if he understood my instinct without sharing it. He said going back would not reset what had already been recorded, and that returning too soon could create more complications than staying would. I asked him who exactly was recording anything about me, and he did not answer directly, only saying that certain systems in his world did not differentiate between intention and proximity. That answer should have meant nothing, but it made my thoughts spiral anyway. I noticed then that the room we were in was not a typical living space, but something closer to a controlled environment, quiet ventilation, no visible entry points beyond the one we used, and a sense that every detail had been designed to reduce unpredictability. Adrian noticed my attention shifting around the room and said I was safe here, repeating the word safe as if it had a specific definition I had not yet learned. I told him safety did not feel like this, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without rejecting it. After a pause, he stood and walked toward a small side area, returning with a bottle of water and placing it on the table in front of me without ceremony. The simplicity of the gesture felt strangely out of place compared to everything else, and I hesitated before taking it. He said I should rest for a while because exhaustion would make everything harder to process. I asked him if he ever got tired of speaking in ways that made simple things sound complicated, and for the first time, something close to faint acknowledgement crossed his face, almost like a brief moment of humanity breaking through structure. He did not answer my question directly, but instead said that clarity was often dangerous in his world, and ambiguity was sometimes necessary for survival. I leaned back slightly, trying to absorb everything, realizing that I was not being threatened in any traditional sense, but I was also not being released, and the space between those two realities felt more disorienting than either extreme. As I sat there, I became aware that my phone was no longer in my pocket, and when I looked toward him, he confirmed without hesitation that it had been secured for now. Before I could react, he added something quieter, saying that I would get it back when it was no longer a variable in what came next. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it had not paused my life. It had simply placed it somewhere I could no longer reach. The room felt quieter after that, as if even the air had adjusted itself to the idea that I was not going anywhere. I sat still, my hands resting on the edge of the table, trying to convince myself that what I was experiencing had limits, that there would be a clear moment where this situation would end and I could step back into the version of my life that included hospital corridors, long shifts, and predictable exhaustion. Adrian Cole remained seated across from me, his posture unchanged, but his attention had shifted slightly, as if he was listening to something beyond the room rather than to me directly. I finally asked him what happens next, because the silence between us had begun to feel like another form of answer I did not understand. He looked at me for a long moment before responding, saying that the next phase depended on how quickly external interest faded from the incident. I asked him what external interest meant, and he answered without hesitation that certain events in this city created attention patterns, and those patterns had to resolve before anything returned to normal flow. I told him again that I did not belong in any of that I had no reason to be connected to attention patterns or incidents or any structure he kept referring to, and my voice cracked slightly at the end despite my effort to stay composed. For the first time, his expression softened in a way that was not calculated, but brief, almost like recognition of something familiar. He said I was not being evaluated for participation, only for exposure, and that distinction mattered more than I currently understood. I looked down at the table, trying to process the idea that my life had shifted from simple existence into something that could be categorized as exposure. After a moment, I asked him if there was any way to reverse it, to return to before, to undo the moment at the intersection. He did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything he had said so far. When he finally spoke, he said that certain moments could not be undone, only resolved forward. I felt a strange tightening in my chest at those words, not because they were threatening, but because they sounded final in a way I was not ready to accept. I asked him if he had ever done this before, brought someone into something like this, and he paused briefly before answering that people entered these situations in different ways, some knowingly and some without choice. I leaned back slightly, trying to steady my breathing, realizing how little control I had over the conversation, over the environment, and over the direction of my own life. A few seconds later, I noticed movement outside the window, subtle figures passing at a distance, and Adrian noticed my attention shift immediately. He said not to focus on movement outside because most of it was procedural and not directed toward me personally. I asked him how he could separate procedural from personal when I was the one being kept here, and for the first time, he did not respond instantly. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window, looking out for a moment before turning back. He said that separation was the only way this world functioned without collapsing into chaos, and that personal interpretation often created unnecessary fear. I told him fear was not unnecessary when you were the one inside it, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without argument. Then he returned to his seat and said something quieter, explaining that once the current attention cycle settled, I would be given a choice about how to proceed, but that choice would depend on what I learned while I was here. I asked him what I was supposed to learn, and he simply said understanding, because misunderstanding was what had brought me here in the first place. I sat in silence after that, feeling the weight of everything I had heard without being able to organize it into anything familiar. For the first time since the accident, I stopped trying to think about going back, not because I accepted this new reality, but because I was beginning to realize that going back might no longer mean what I thought it did.